it would always roll back to the subject of race. I do actually believe that Western civilization is probably the best form of living ever devised to mankind, which, coming from somebody like me, a chauvinist Hong Kong nationalist who hates, well, who hates mainlanders, is not unexpected or even saying a lot. But what really makes it so profound is that Western people, and let's just say it, white people, don't really understand the type of society they've made. They have created a society in multiple countries, despite being only 16% of the global population, that has combined a modicum of economic freedom with some sort of representative, in Marxist terms, bourgeois democracy.
We take things from the world and we perfect it. Yet, you touched on colonialization and oppression. All civilizations have had, oppression, have used things like slavery. It wasn't just the West that had slavery, but what the West has tended to have done is, perfected it, industrialized it. We unfortunately, we did that with colonialization. We built these huge global empires. We enslaved people, and that was terrible. We're not a perfect civilization. There's definitely cons to Western civilization, but on the whole, when you look at it compared to other civilizations, I think we have created the best so far. One of the evidences of that is, the world speaks English. It wears Western fashion. It almost an admiration of Western civilization, and so much so that Westernization is associated with a country progressing, with it developing, with it becoming modern. And I think for the time being, while lots of civilizations have potential, I would argue the science civilization has a lot of potential, and the natural order is that to dominate economically. So if China can sort of hack soft power, which it hasn't yet managed to do, it could, in 200, 300 years, we might look back and think differently on this discussion. Some people would say, the Hindu civilization has a lot of potential as well. So I don't think we're at the end of history, that some thinkers like Francis Fukuyama would argue. I do think where we are now, the West is, more in the pro column. So far, the best civilization we've experienced. It's the way Western ideas have spread globally, been the foundation of all different countries. Even China, the main threat that you might see to the West, it's built on Marxism. It's built on Western ideology, ultimately, because it's adapted it, socialism with Chinese characteristics, but there's not really an equivalent. Confucianist thought hasn't penetrated Western ideology or Western philosophy or Western thought in the same way. So I'm still inclined to say it is, while all civilizations have contributed a lot and are great in their own right, the West has prevailed so far. How that changes is yet to be seen.
The West has also came up with a lot of great thought, great thinkers. There's a lot of philosophy that we see all around today. That the Enlightenment has brought up a lot of things and beliefs about morals and principles. It's also invented the scientific method. With that all being said, right, how would you be able to kind of justify the things that the West are still currently doing, even when we have like the science out there, which was, something that the West actually created, to really show the impacts of, I'm not a climate alarmist by any means, but like in terms of climate change, they have had the worst impact on the world. There's tons of greenhouse gases, global emissions, and we're still not listening to the science on that one. We're still progressing on with all of these things that, yes, you you can say other civilizations are doing it too, especially China. But then if you look into the data of like how China's managing their carbon emissions, it's all coming from manufacturing things from the West itself. So yeah, how would you kind of like ponder those philosophies and be so enlightened, and yet at the same time continue on with allowing these things to happen to the world? When you speak about like slavery and all those systems, yes, you know, like the British Empire did end slavery, and also there are still slavery that's ongoing in the world, especially in the Middle East. You know, the millions that are still enslaved today. And to say that, you know, you see like, you know, other cultures are still having this kind of systems, but how much did the West actually impact those societies or those economies to kind of rely on slavery as a means of getting by? You know, had it not been from their expectations that these countries would be out of that today, would you consider that like, you know, a bit of like a hand waving thing, a sort of like a distraction?
I think if I start with you, Agent P, and your comments, I think your first one was on the regards to the environment and how you could argue that Western civilization has, you know, destroyed the planet potentially through climate change and industrialization. And I think I would say that my thoughts on that is, in a way, and I hope that I don't outrage everyone on this call by saying this, but I think it's the case of West was a victim of its own success. And what I mean by that is we just got there first. We started industrializing first before the seeds of, you know, ideas of environmentalism and sustainability really caught on. And I'm not convinced that if the West didn't excel so much in the 1800s and 1900s, I'm not convinced that if any other civilization did that, whether it was Orthodox, whether it was African, whether it was Islamic, whichever civilization would industrialize first, that they would have done things differently. I think if the Islamic civilization was the first to industrialization, that, you know, they would have harmed the planet just as much as the West did. I think the problem is that we were first. But obviously, you know, destroying the effort, a terrible thing, but I do feel as well, actually, you know, this is one thing where I do dislike the way how the West approaches a lot of the world, is we do kind of patronize it. And, you know, we do tell developing countries, no, you can't cut down your forest to develop, which is a bit hypocritical because, you know, we did it in order to develop ourselves, but an advantage on the global scene. But sorry, yeah, where was I going? Oh yeah, Shams were talking about yeah, hard power. I wanted to focus more on hard power, military, hegemony. I think that sadly, one measure of what is a successful civilization is its ability to force others to adopt its way of life, its thinking, and its culture. And we have to go zoom in a little bit here. So I'm going to focus on this particular civilization within Western civilization. So if you look at the, we're going quite far back here, and I'm sorry to do this because I did want to focus more on contemporary politics, but if we look at the Roman Empire, part of the reason for its success was just how violent it was and how it was able to do military conquest and very aggressively compared to its neighbors. There's an excellent little short documentary on this, which I can find. But for its time, you know, it just didn't stop conquering its neighbors. You know, it started with the Italian peninsula, then Carthage in North Africa, and then spreading throughout the majority of the European continent. And one of the reasons for its success was, yeah, it could militarily take over these countries and destroy them, and it was ingenious in how it stole, you know, we were talking about origins, you know, how it stole ideas from different civilizations, integrated them into its own military. If we want to do a clash of civilizations, looking at Carthage, a Middle Eastern North African empire, you know, when Rome first went to war with Carthage, it didn't really have a navy, it didn't have naval power. It actually found a shipwrecked Carthaginian boat and copied the plans for the boat, and then built its own navy that rivaled Carthage in like 3 months. You know, it was excellent at absorbing ideas and molding it. But then when it conquered powers, it didn't just absorb them and rule them, you know, from top down. It convinced the citizens to this idea of Roman civilization. You know, people in France conquered territory of the Roman Empire, saw themselves as Roman citizens who adopt the language, the idea of system of governance. And I think you can zoom out with that idea and look at it on a civilization perspective. What the West is great at, which I think is necessary for a civilization to survive, it's great at taking over. Yeah, yes, militarily we can do that, and we have done that. You know, colonization in the past. You know, in modern days, I think you can quite easily argue that NATO, you know, basically an instrument of the West.
Independence. The thing that I'm trying to say here is, if you take like countries like Canada, Australia, Hong Kong, Singapore, right? Most of them, basically, they were colonized as well, but they get their independence. They civilize them, because let's be honest, colonization is just a racist way of saying, you know, we think we're superior than you. So they colonized us, they gave us the civilization, then they gave us back the land, and all those countries are prospering. Can you name one country in Africa that is prospering since the end of this colonization in Africa? So that's again where my point is going. There is a little bit of no, I wouldn't say racism, but it's really a hidden agenda in those civilizations that we're being taught. We are taught, you're right, we are taught there is no civilization that can happen without empowerment, you know, without empowering, you know, the other civilization. Yes, every civilization is done since the dawn of time. Even Mayans did it, Aztec did it, you take it, most of the nations, civilization did it. Sorry, because I'm a French spoken, so I tend to put some French words in there. But the most important thing is, once we are civilized, why did we not attain the top civilization that we needed? You know, for like other countries, we have the raw materials in our countries, but yet we did not. So this is why I'm basically skeptical about the Western civilization. Yes, there is no doubt it's the greatest, but I'm asking my question, to whom? You know, this is the thing. To whom? Are we benefiting from? Yeah. So, but the last thing also is, when you take, sorry about that, the last thing is also when you take like the countries, even within former colonies, when we're talking about colonialism, English former colonies, they all have their own money. But in Africa, still today, most African French colonies are under the same currency since the colonial time, since the brutal civilization.
Mm-hmm. So I think what I really want to do there is connect both those thoughts that you have. You talked about, and you have to be patient with me here, because Africa is nowhere near my expertise. I focus almost entirely on East Asian politics and my time at school. But you talk about colonization being over, African countries getting their independence, but not thriving in the same way that former British colonies such as Singapore or the white Commonwealth countries of Australia and Canada have thrived. And then you touched on the end there about how French African countries still using the same currency. And I was vaguely aware of that. I think there is a francs or something using, it's kind of tied to the French currency. I'm not entirely sure how it works. Yeah, but
it's the colonial, basically Communauté Française, colonial franc that we use. You're right. Yeah.
I have heard of this. Yes. Please be patient. I'm not an expert. What I would just like to do is connect those two thoughts and just say, my view of the world and the way how it exists is that the colonization and oppression of Africa hasn't ended. So yes, you have your nationhood independence in Africa, which, by the way, is a very Western concept. The concept of a nation state, of having a flag. And one point that I like to make when I have these conversations is listen to the national anthems of African countries. Even listen to the national anthem of Singapore. Is that music what you would associate with that civilization and culture? No, it's usually a sort of Western classical music and tune. I mean, I can't think of one on the top of my head for Africa, but you know, and when I think of, like you see in Asian countries, a lot of them have orchestral music. The exception is China, which is it's a war song from the war with China. But you know, and the idea of having a flag, a nation state, all very Western ideas that we've imposed on you. But despite you having a nation state, despite you having a flag, despite you having a very non-African national anthem, I don't think that the oppression of your country has ended. And I think that African countries are essentially colonized, essentially oppressed, exploited by not just Western civilization, but let's be honest, mainly through the system of global capitalism. So I would say it's not ending. You know, you touched on you go into the library and not being able to find African academics, and I'm sure they exist, and I'm sure they're trying to contribute to academia, but that is because of the oppression of your civilization by primarily, but not exclusively, Western civilization. And unfortunately, that thing that's happening, that just to be clear, you know, I don't agree with these things. That's happening because of the supremacy and hegemony of Western civilization. And that is by its nature one of the things, sadly, that makes it great. And you ask a brilliant question, which I loved, which is great for who? Superior for who? And obviously civilizations look after their own. So, you know, it's good for, you know, as I think the only white person on this call, white Westerner on this call, you know, it's good for me. It's good for the white Westerners. But, you know, if I can do a circle to sort of what I was saying at the start of the call, I do think that, you know, Western civilization has contributed many grapes to the world that we use every day, that we think every day, that builds our world and our world structures, that no other similar civilization has yet done. Yeah, I think I just wanted to connect that the start of what you were saying and the end of you saying is, I don't think colonization as oppression has ended, but sadly that is the feature of the African civilization being oppressed by, quote unquote, a superior, greater civilization. There are definitely what you could say imperial, I'm not sure if I like the term imperial for this, but there's definitely sort of a culturally hegemonic reasons behind China's involvement in Africa. And you can see that through the use of Confucius institutes, pushing quite hard for particularly East Africans to learn Mandarin in schools.
Yes. Yes.
So you know, you touched on language earlier. China wants to have a lot of soft
Do you know
power.
that? Yes. Do you know that? Sorry to interrupt you, Stephen. The new headquarters of the African Union was built by China as a present. So just between us, it's just a presumption. Do you know how many listening devices can be put in that building? You know, I'm sure it's not. They're saying, you see, that's another thing, beauty of civilization. They build a building, but again, they leave it behind. But when we have, that's exactly what I said to, you know, the German diplomat. I said to him, look, if the Western civilization was good to us, we will never, ever let China or Russia come in Africa. But if you belittle us, you're not basically looking after our needs or let us be independent, as you said we should be. Then if you treat us as basically trade partners, we will be happy to adopt your civilization, even basically give some of our cultures. But if you are not making us happy, then of course, it's only a human nature that we will say to someone who will make us feel better. This is what I explained to him. If China is becoming a hegemon in Africa now, it's because of the Western civilization's fault. And I will explain this to you in clearly ways, because you just mentioned earlier the beauty of it. For example, we have Arriva that is exploiting uranium in Niger. And they were actually going to build, Arriva is a form of EDF. Basically, French EDF is part of Arriva. They mine the uranium and they create your central nuclear that was, I think 20 billion is going to be built recently. So in general, Niger has got no central nuclear at all. Electricity power cut is basically crippling hospitals and everything. And Niger is one of the hottest countries on earth you can think of, which basically means even now we might be 45 degrees Celsius. So how come a country that is basically exploiting uranium and coal to power Western central nuclears or charcoal nuclear electricity power generators is still basically don't have a railway system, Stephen, a railway system. See, so China will come, they will build a stadium or they will build a railway, they will take what they want. But this is what I'm saying. The civilization is really great, but the West needs to rethink again that the way they used to colonize people is not going to work anymore because people are awakened. You know, they have awakened the taste for people's eyes and people will not basically going to be silent. They know what good life tastes like or feels like. You cannot basically, the genie is out, you cannot put the genie back in the bottle. That's my expression. That's as simple as I can put it. I hope you understand.
No, I do totally. And I also think that the West is stuck in its old ways and doesn't quite know how to approach African civilization now. But yeah, I do think that Chinese involvement in Africa, you know, while there are questions about it, and I'm not really a fan of conspiracies such as you know, hidden microphones and in parliamentary buildings. I'm not sure how much grounding in truth that is, but I do think that China is.
No, that's just me basically saying hypothetically, but you know, somebody build you a building and say, take the building. Obviously, come on, Stephen. I'm pretty sure that is something attached to it. That's just a human nature thing. You know, I'm thinking as a human, you know, somebody build a house and say, oh, take the house, Stephen. It's just me being kind to you. How often do that happen? How often?
Yeah, so I don't think China is just doing this out of the good of its heart. Obviously, it wants stuff in
That's
return.
it. Thank you. That's exactly what I mean to say.
The point I was more getting at is that I don't think you can equate Chinese hegemony. I don't think it quite has hegemony yet in Africa, but Chinese attempts of influence in Africa is quite the same as how the West approaches Africa. I guess one thing, just to steer the conversation back to great civilizations and away from a specific instance of colonization, if I can. I think one thing you touch on, and this is why I want to take your point and leave with this, is the West not quite sure how to deal with its international relations and how to approach countries. And I do think, and this is perhaps controversial to a lot of American in particular thinkers, or those on the Western right, but I do think the West is a civilization in decline. You know, I think that whilst it is the greatest civilization that we've seen so far, I do think the West broadly is declining and being challenged by what I would call cynic civilizations. So I wouldn't just solely put that on China, but also other East Asian civilizations, such as the Korean civilization and the Vietnamese civilization and so on. I think that them as a collective pose a threat to Western hegemony. And you can see how China is trying to convert its hard power into soft power. You know, look at the, if I can just move away a bit from, I think we've covered hard power. If I can move back to soft power a little bit in culture, you can see how China, in the context of Africa, trying to spread the Chinese language, but also if you look at how Chinese influence in filmmaking, you know, China is converting its hard, raw economic power to influence the soft power of the West, getting Hollywood movies to film in China, to, you know, have Chinese elements in the film, Chinese lead actors. You know, you're starting to see improved representation of Asians in Western media. You know, the Western man has gone in film has gone from a very feminized, weak, sneaky, tricksy, that's the word I call it, tricksy character in films, to, you know, you're starting to see strong Asian male leads. Asian women have gone from being incredibly sexualized, and they're now starting to be empowered in Western cinema. And I think this is all an influence of the rise of China as the West adapts its culture in order to sell to its markets. I would say that, yeah, you know, I think I mentioned earlier that if you look at the timeline of human history, China has almost always been the #1 economic power. It's a blip in history that the West has dominated economically, and I think that's the natural order of the world that we're going to return to at some point soon. I guess the question is, how successful is China going to be in converting its converting that raw hard power into soft power? And I think while it has started to improve on that, Chinese language is a growing language. Will it replace English as the international language? I don't think so. Even when China is the #1 power, are we all suddenly going to start listening to Chinese music? And whilst there's always going to be niche communities that, you know, love K-pop or love Chinese rap, is it going to replace the music hegemons of Northern Europe, of Scandinavia and the American music industry? In our lifetimes, at least, even beyond that, the foreseeable, I don't see that. I think that, you know, we can debate hard power all we like, but I still think, you know, Western culture is here to stay for many more generations, and I think that's one of the things that has contributes to the world as a net good.
If
Go
I
on,
may,
Phil.
Jay, like Karim,
Yeah.
I've just been quite silent because I was just loving the conversation between you and Shams. It was just really nice to let it flow. I was learning a lot of stuff. I think Lapgong has picked up a lot of stuff too, so much so that his mind has exploded and it's probably left off the call now or something. But I'll like to steer back a bit of, like, you know, the points that you were making, especially the whole first country argument, which I feel like it's a bit of a red herring, like, you know, just to be let off scot-free. It's a bit of a cop out of saying that, like, it's kind of using like a what if argument mixed in with like a random truism that would get me to agree, right? Like, this is like saying, well, actually, if colonizers didn't invade Africa, they would probably be the best superpower now. They are filled with minerals, spices, and, like, you know, raw materials, right? Which is undeniably true, but like that wasn't at the heart of what I was promoting, I guess. And I guess also, like, to add on to the points that were raised, right? Just to steer the conversation a bit back. Like right now, even with the knowledge of climate change and environmentalism, they still put corporate interests first. The West, capitalism basically is the reason why, you know, Shell and ExxonMobil have been known to cover up the damages of their operations, or even go as far to spread disinformation years after they know through the science already that, you know, how fossil fuels were shitty for the world, you know, how these leaders act. You know, look at Boris Johnson, look at Liz Truss, Priti Patel, Rishi Sunak, how in the UK, especially when I've came for the first few years, and then really understand how these politicians were actually just sluts for big corporations and corporate interests, how they actually, the democracy that actually exists in the UK, it's actually kind of like legalized corruption in a sense. You know, how they're just voted in, they're legalized to pollute the global north, and just because they're voted in with like this, the shining spectre or the label of democracy, that makes it okay. Do you not see that, like, at the same time, this whole like Western idea of like materialism, you know, you mentioned like fast fashion, and then again with like my critique on how energy companies are raping the world and polluting like lower developed countries, that the whole Western idea of democracy, which came from the Greeks, like enables or legalizes this totally immoral acts. Like, yes, the West is the best, but only if you consider the best at like speed running everything, you know, slavery, ending slavery, civil rights, gay rights, and now falling birth rates. Will we see the fall of the West soon? Relying on African and Asian bodies through immigration. Like you've also mentioned, like, you know, not just in the West, but globally, it has added a lot of value to the world. And I would kind of dig deeper and like ask, like, in terms of like, if we to look at jobs, for instance, most CEOs, most, you know, middle management aren't actually coming from any of these other countries that are in the West itself. You know, we just really just import, or we just have heavy immigration on jobs that people in the UK don't want to do. Like, you look at the builders, you look at the cleaners, most of them are from the Black, Asian minority ethnicity. And so, like, what's next? You know, speed running the end of the world, is that what we would consider the best civilization? I know you also touched on like music, like how it has become like sort of a global hegemony, in a sense of how like the West has influences everywhere. But I wouldn't be so sure, so confident about that, because like if you look at jazz and rock, those like so-called Western sorts of forms of music were actually coming from the Black artists, which they kind of stole from. Like, you look at Elvis Presley, for instance, right, and how he stole from many Black artists that came before him. And also you mentioned K-pop. Yes, that is actually quite a big one as well. You know, how they are actually westernizing themselves and their culture. And how you mentioned like that was a mark of like, you know, a great civilization, which I guess then the question comes to like, you know, for who and for what. And like, would you consider them, you know, practicing, you know, 6 hours a day to the point of exhaustion, just to be looked at like a certain lens in the Western sphere, more like in sort of like a superior, or like of how they're kind of using like lighting or like lightening creams to appear more white, in a way they sound or speak. Like, what good of these Western influences actually bring to society? What, like, yes, they are there, we acknowledge that they are there in some form or another, but like, what good of them being there is there actually to talk about? Go for it.
Yeah, sorry, I don't want to hog all the time, but I feel like most of that was was aimed at me. So let me just work with that. Let me just work backwards, actually. So I'm going to start with the end of your point there, on terms of, you know, are these cultural soft power influences such as music a good thing? You're talking about the K-pop industry, which is crazy. You know, I'm not really a fan of K-pop, but I have read all about it, and there are a couple of songs that I find catchy. So I have looked into it, and then these big Korean corporations who, you know, control what they eat, how they look, all that. I think one thing that I want to stress here is I don't think a good civilization is measured by how benevolent it is. I don't think you can say that a civilization is superior because it exclusively spreads good. You know, I think we all agree that the Western civilization has contributed good and bad, but some of those bad things are what makes it great. That probably sounds bad, but what I mean is, you know, civilization as a unit, if you try to, I mean, it's hard. I can't think, you can't really have a Western civilization isn't a coherent unit. You know, it's made up of multiple parts. You know, you have the Anglo-Saxon part of it, you have the Gallic part of it, the Roman, the Greek, even the Eastern European, different components in it. But as I touched on earlier with using the example of Rome and Carthage, you know, one thing that makes a civilization great is its ability to absorb and get people to live in its way, and follow its way of life, and follow its ideas, and follow its philosophy, and all of that. And so the fact that, you know, these Koreans are going through this and doing ultimately quite a Western thing is testament to the greatness as a concept of being great as opposed to being good of the Western civilization. Continuing with your points, following backwards, you touched on some of the great music that we have in the world, such as jazz and rap and rock and roll, and how it has its origins within Black communities in America. Why I say to that is that's Western. Jazz, rap, rock and roll is Western. African Americans are Western. They follow Western culture. These, of course, origins in Africa, obviously racial, but we're not talking about which race.
That's it. Sorry for controlling, checking quickly, Stephen. No, it's the other way around, I think. Western copy those because we still have, even if you take, for example, the Afrobeat, people were twerking recently here, but in Africa, people have been twerking in many generations. They only started twerking in the year 2000. So, sorry, just basically a quick jump in before I forget that one. I think most of the rhythm was basically from African origin, and most of them were introduced in the West through slavery, like the gospel. Before, people don't basically even sing in churches and all that, but Black Americans stopped doing so.
Yeah. So I completely recognize things like Afrobeats and stuff, and music has origins within African music. Well, perhaps I communicated myself wrong there. What I meant to say is that I see, I'm not defining a civilization by its race. So I see Black people who, born and raised within Britain, within America, they are, especially African Americans, actually, I would say, overwhelmingly follow Western culture. And I mean, this is me talking as a white British person. You might have a different feeling to this, but my feeling is, if you were to pluck an African American off the street of the USA and put him down in Africa, he wouldn't be culturally integrated.
Most definitely.
So he follows Western culture. He is part. He may be Black, but he is part of Western civilization. Let me just use an African American artist in the USA. Let's talk about Kanye. I would see Kanye as a Westerner. He is from Western civilization. The music he makes, yes, you can trace a lineage. You can follow the journey of this music and how it has origins in African music from Africa. But these things like jazz and rap were made by African Americans in the West who largely followed Western culture. So that's why I would say that jazz and rap and grime here in the UK, whilst it's led by Black people, it is part of Western culture because these people are Westerners. Sure, I'm really keen not to see civilization, not to confuse civilization and race. You can go.
Yes.
I keep banging on about the Roman Empire. Sorry. Yeah.
Quickly with that, before you jump to the Roman. So you see, I think basically the civilization started in Africa. Then it was brought, the Westerners developed it, or change it. Just because you take something and change it, it doesn't basically mean that it's your civilization. So most of those, I totally understand. Many of, even me now, when I'm talking or when I'm speaking to people back home, they say to me, "You're lost. You're not one of us." See, forget about those who were born here or Kanye West or things like that. Totally, you're right. I do not want to mix race to civilization. Anyone within the area of that civilization is basically part of that civilization. But again, taking something, we're talking about cultural appropriation. For example, when you take British people dressing as geishas, that's the same thing. I don't mind it. Or white people blackening their faces. They say, "Oh yeah, that's wrong. It's not cool." No, if anything, they're trying to adapt my civilization. That's fine. They're not doing anything. They're only learning. But if you do that to mock me, then we have a problem. But if you're doing that for cultural, understanding, that's fine by me. You see, that's the difference. So you can have something from a different culture, change it or make it better. That's fine. But would you say that that basically is your civilization, or that belong to that person's civilization? Like the example of a geisha.
Yeah.
The Romans. Yeah, the
So
Romans.
yeah, I'll avoid going back to Rome, because I keep doing that. So I'm going to avoid doing that. But what I would say is, though, I think maybe saying civilization makes it confusing. Would you say jazz is American, or would you say it's Nigerian, for instance? The answer is jazz is American, and so it was made by Africans and African Americans, and so people can trace their lineage back. You're talking about how a lot of culture and basically everything you can sort of trace back comes to Africa. Of course, that's because where the human species is from, Africa. You can always trace everything back to Africa. And you're talking about cultural appropriation. I think the example that immediately popped to my head is, would you say French fries are French? Or because they're made from potatoes, they're from the Incan civilization? No, you would say French fries are quintessentially a Western dish, just because the potato has its origins within Central America. I'm sorry, this example is quite cheesy, but just because it has some roots that you can trace back to the African continent, I think that doesn't make jazz, rap in the US, or grime in the UK a part of African culture. I would say it's still Western culture, just made by people who can trace their lineage to Africa. I mean, talking about America is difficult, because America, who will always dominate a conversation about Western culture because they are the hegemon of a hegemon. The Western is a hegemony, but the America is a hegemony within the West.
America is way
they're only like 300 years old. So is anything American? Unless we start talking about Native Americans, sadly, I would say the civilization not really existing anymore because of the white genocide. But I would hesitate to go down that route. A lot of people of Britain. Sorry, if I can just finish this point. A lot of people in Britain say, for instance, "Oh well, the Queen's German." No, she's not. Like, yeah, she has German family roots, but the Queen was British. So I'm very hesitant to follow this line of thought that jazz and rap is part of African civilization. I disagree with that. I think that is part of Western civilization, contributed by non-white people, sure, but it is an American thing, and America is part of Western civilization. I think African Americans are just as much part of Western civilization as myself. Sure, I can perhaps trace my ancestry further back in the UK, but I think African American culture is part of Western culture and Western civilization. And just before I hand over the floor, and I'm sorry, I do feel like I'm dominating this. Just before I hand over, I just really want to address all of Agent's piece points that he made across. He was talking about the environment and fast fashion and slavery, and how that's a world evil, Western civilizations destroying the world. And I would say, I would say that is capitalism, which of course is part of Western civilization, and it is definitely a negative. It's a horrible thing, and you do need an international proletariat, an international slave class to sustain capitalism. But and it's horrible. But I don't think that counters the fact that Western civilization is the greatest civilization that we've seen so far, and that's just part of its hegemony. As I keep hammering, benevolent, peaceful civilizations don't become great hegemons or great powers. They erase themselves from existence.
True. Yeah, true. And you're right. To conclude, yes, it's the great civilization, but to whom? To whom? That's the thing. To whom? Because so far, it's only beneficial for some and not to all. So is a Western civilization the greatest? For me, that rest to see. Hopefully, things might change in my lifetime. But the way things are going, I don't think that Africa will benefit from this great civilization of the West. Because for me, we're still basically under the same kind of ideology they colonized in Africa in the first place. They are going to bring us civilization, and we're still waiting for that civilization to come. So I can't judge a civilization as an African. I can't tell a civilization is great as an African if I haven't benefited from it yet. But we'll wait to see. And as an academic, with all the things that the Western civilization has accomplished, I can basically say that there are very good things that come out of the Western civilization. We can say many things from I don't know, the Industrial Revolution to back in the Renaissance, all the way to the modern day technology that is rolling out. So all in all, yes, as an academic, I cannot basically close my eyes and pretend that does not exist. But as an African, as someone who was basically colonized under the pretext of uncivilized, because they're going to bring me a civilization, that rest to be seen. I'm still basically waiting to see that great civilization to basically be expanded on my continent. Thank you.
Next one. I mean, I share a very similar sentiment as well. Like, seeing as how it's not going to be a very sustainable model for being the best, I will kind of question whether that would come into play in some consideration at all. But for the most part, yeah, I do agree with all the points and the bits of like how the many inventions, the laptops that we have today, the platforms that we're speaking on, the scientific method, all of those things were part of Western civilization, Western culture. It's undeniable. And of course, if I'm proven wrong and like the next 100 years doesn't see the whole end of the world from being torched on itself due to global warming and all that, then yeah, sure. Like obviously, it wasn't a civilization that ended the world, and it was the best for its time of how it ran. Any closing thoughts, SJ?
I'm aware that we're sort of winding down, and I'm probably about to throw another bomb in the conversation. So I apologize for that in advance if it happens. But I would say that you have benefited from Western civilization. Like, yes, horrible things have happened, colonization, imperialism, and oppression, but you benefit from many great contributions from Western civilization today. And I'm not just talking about the laptop that you're on and the internet that you're using, but more theoretical concepts, the rights of freedom of speech, the fact we're allowed to have this conversation, concepts of you as an individual, all sort of stems from Western thought. You can go back as far as the Magna Carta when the Lords first started taking their rights from the monarch. You enjoy benefits provided from Western thought, from Western developments, and not just tangible things, but concepts.
John, sorry, Stephen, quickly on that note, before the colonialism, Africa was basically, I know because my family is a noble family, believe it or not, before the arrival of the Western civilization in Africa, everyone was living like during King John's, every man's house is a castle, we have a voice, they have a voice, a woman have a voice and everything. It's when we have colonialism that we lost our freedom of speech. And this is one of the reasons, I told you that I'm a person seeking sanctuary in UK. That's one of the reasons the Western civilization that I thought I have my freedom of speech in my country. That's why I ran to here in this country. So again, did I benefit from that in my country? Again, rest to see, because I thought I had my freedom of speech. I thought I can express myself. And that's why I'm a person seeking sanctuary in UK now. Do you see where I'm going with that? So it's really, again, before that, in Africa, believe it or not, even my grandparents, my granddad, I'm an old boy, but my granddad, my mom's dad, I sit there and chat with him. You know, he basically tells me things that were happening before the colonialism, because he died at old age. Me, myself, I'm 45 years old, believe it or not. And my mom and my dad were basically born during the Second World War, before the Second World War, if I might say so. So, you know, before all that happened, my granddad is still basically telling me stories that they used to be able to do as a community. You know, you have a problem with your neighbor, you solve it between you. And in a polite way, you basically have the freedom of speech, even in the King's Court at any time. You don't have to ask audiences or something. You just walk in the throne room and then speak. But all that is gone in our countries now. You know, they have a structure, proper governance. But when the Western civilization came, they basically put in place administrations. And those administrations are actually like racist, not favorable for anyone. So again, what point colonialism were basically good for us? Western civilization was good for us. I thought it's basically the civilization I can elect the person I want. If I elect, they are not counting that, they are frauding, they are causing fraud. And if I speak, or if I want to demonstrate, I get beaten. If I try to educate children about their rights, what the Western civilization told me, basically I'm causing trouble for basically empowering the young students. So as a person who is seeking sanctuary in UK, this is one of the reasons, again, that I'm saying it's really a gray area for me, Stephen. I hope you understand.
No, I do. And I guess this is where I do have I have to confess my ignorance on pre-colonial African civilizations. But what I guess the point I was trying to make more about things, say like the Magna Carta and so on, the West has established international norms, codified norms on things such as human rights and a general sense of the power of the individual. I mean, I'm not familiar with these African civilizations, but I am curious if you could go to the king's court and openly criticize the king, how well that would go down. I'm also a bit hesitant to look back on these ancient civilizations with rose-colored glasses and, you know, did everyone just peacefully solve the solutions, the problems? Probably not. I think, you know, there probably was tribal warfare. You know, these great empires of Africa didn't just arise peacefully. There was still conquest and still violence. But you know, I would say, well, you know, I would say that you've probably benefited in your lifetime from codified Western ideas of human rights and freedom of speech and similar things like that. In terms of, you know, whether that is existing, you know, you look at the UK and how Priti Patel has removed the right to protest. You can see how the far right has just won an election in Italy, how it's always on the verge of winning elections in France. You know, fascism and its goal of removing
in Hungary.
Yeah, Hungary is another excellent one. You know,
Viktor Orban.
These, I would say, are symptoms of decline of a civilization. And you know, we're doing circles here. And you know, we talk about whether the sustainability of the civilization means it was great. You know, I come back to, you know, nothing lasts forever. I think it runs in cycles. But just because we are in the late stage of a civilization, the twilight, its decline, I still maintain my position that it was one of the greatest civilizations, and still is for now. One of the best civilization that we have. but it's just an awkward conversation to have because no, it isn't. It's twilight. If we were having this conversation 50 years ago, you know, it would be a very different conversation. But because we are in its twilight years, it's a complex one to have. But I would still maintain my stance that yes, it's declining. Yes, it's an end. Yes, it's finite. But from what we've experienced so far, it has been the greatest in human civilization. So
I
far.
understand. I
Yeah.
understand it, Stephen, definitely. And I basically respect your position. And the same, I do know that, yeah, it's one of the greatest civilization in the world, you know, so far. But for whom, you know, for whom is that really beneficial? So, yeah.